If you have your Bibles, please open to the book of Ruth in the Old Testament. Ruth chapter 2. We have been very slowly working our way through the book of Ruth, and we are coming to the end of chapter 2 this morning. I was reminded this week as I was looking over this passage and studying it and thinking about it, I was reminded of a couple of things, some stories that I had heard. One was from a friend who was telling me about, it was an older gentleman who was telling me about the time that he had spent as a child. He was kind of living through the end of the Great Depression, and he remembers having an opportunity to go and have dinner. And when he got to the kitchen, there wasn't any food. And he remembered that his parents asked them to join him and pray for their meal. They sat around this table with no main course on it. There was maybe a couple of vegetables, but nothing else. And as they prayed, while they were praying, there was a knock on the door. And there was a knock on the door, and they went to answer it, and it was a friend of theirs from down the street, and he said, "Hey, we were given a ham, and it was too much for our family to eat. Could you use half a ham?" He said, "Yes, we could use half a ham." They welcomed it in, and they brought it in, and they shared that meal together. They had this full meal together. And I was talking to this friend of mine, and he was telling me this story of how he always has remembered that. He has remembered that every day of his life when he sits down to pray for his meal, how God provided for them. That wasn't just something that they did. They didn't just pray before the meal because that's what you're supposed to do, but they depended on the Lord and they asked God, and God answered and God provided. What a wonderful example of God's faithfulness to provide for His people. And one of the things that we are going to see this morning is how God provides for His people. The title of the sermon is "Our God is Always Faithful." And He is always faithful to provide what His children need. So would you follow along while I read from Ruth chapter 2. I'm going to be reading verses 17 through 23. So she, that's Ruth, she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, "The man's name with whom I worked today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And Ruth, the Moabite, said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. This story is a wonderful story of provision for Ruth and Naomi. And yet there is so much happening, so much going on in this one paragraph. We were looking last week at how Boaz was providing for Ruth, how he was a good and kind redeemer, is what he is called. And this morning, we're looking at the continuation of this story. Ruth has been working hard. She worked from early morning until evening with only one short rest. And after that, after going through the fields and gleaning, picking up the scraps, as it were, and even being left some by Boaz's workers, she takes all that she had and she goes and she has to beat the grain out to turn it into something that is usable. And she works hard, and so when she gets ready to go home, she has plenty. Boaz had made sure that this was more than she would have gotten anywhere else. And so one of the things that we start to see at the very beginning of this part of the story is that God used Boaz to provide plenty, to provide even more than what Ruth needed. Earlier in the story, back in verses 15 and 16, 14 through 16, it talked about how Ruth was given food from Boaz's table, and she had so much that she didn't even need to finish it all. She saved some for later. And then Boaz goes on and tells his workers not just to let her glean after them and pick up the scraps, but also to take some out and give it to her, leaving bundles behind for her to pick up. Boaz provides plenty for Ruth. He provides more than she needs. And there's an interesting thing going on here because it is through her hard work and through the care of Boaz that Ruth returns home with all that she could need. Both of these things are true. If she had worked really, really hard, but Boaz had not taken care to leave some for her, maybe she would have had enough, but she wouldn't have had this overflow. On the other hand, if she hadn't worked hard at all, even though Boaz left some for her, she wouldn't have gathered enough to have all this left over. It's the two of them doing what they were both meant to do, what they both ought to do, that leads to them having plenty. Boaz caring for Ruth and Ruth working hard. But, I love this, when she returns home, my Bible says she had an ephah of barley. Isn't that wonderful? You're looking at me saying, what's an ephah? Well, that's fair. So I looked at the footnote in my Bible, and it has this very helpful footnote. An ephah of barley is about 3/5 of a bushel. I'm not sure that's any more helpful. What this works out to in terms that we might be able to visualize and understand, it works out to about 22 liters. So think about 11 soda bottles full of grain. That was kind of the way that I visualized it. It says she carried all of this home. I was thinking about carrying 11 bottles of soda in my grocery bags. She probably had a better bag than the plastic ones that we get today. She was able to carry all of this home, but she carries all of this grain home. Now think about that. That's a lot of grain for one day's work. That's a lot. And so she takes all of this home and she gets home and she shows it to Naomi, and they have all of that they need. But this is a point that kind of comes up again and again in the book of Ruth. One thing that is consistently pointed out is that God is the one who's really at work. God is the one who's doing things kind of behind the scenes. The writer of Ruth consistently points out that God is moving, and we also see the people acting in faith and doing what they are supposed to do. So when we say something like the point that I have written down on your notes page, which says God used Boaz to provide plenty, that's one thing, but what we see is that the people are also doing what they are supposed to do. They are at work. It's not as though Ruth and Boaz become robots, only good to do what God is doing, but God is working in them and working through them and drawing them and bringing these things together. God is the one who is at work, but that doesn't take away from the fact that Boaz has been raised in the faith and is acting on his faith, on his understanding of how he is supposed to take care of other people. He has been led by his faith and his life so that when this opportunity is in front of him, he wants to do the right thing and actually takes action and acts on it. So God has been preparing him. God has been leading him to this point so that he is able to take the action that is necessary. And Ruth does not receive God's provision through Boaz if she does not act in faith and consistency with her own character and go out in the field and work hard and work with humility. It's her hard work and her humility, it says, that leads her to turning all of this grain to her mother-in-law. And yet God is at work. It is this interplay between God who is in control, God who is sovereign over all things, working all things for good. And yet the people that are living through these events are acting in ways that are consistent with their own character because of how God has led them through their lives. And so Ruth and Naomi are completely provided for because God has been using Boaz to take care of them. This is actually part of what Naomi draws out of this. This is the conclusion that she draws as she sees what is going on. What happens next is Naomi recognizes God's faithfulness. She sees that this is from God. Verses 19 to 22 say this, "When her mother-in-law said to her, 'Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you.'" And then down in verse 20, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi is shocked. Imagine this. She sent her daughter-in-law out in the morning to go and get some grain so that they would be able to make some flour, so they'd be able to make some bread, so they would have food that night. And instead, she comes back with this huge amount of grain, this 22 liters of grain. And I think it's fair to say she's a little surprised by that. Where did you go? Where did you find all this? How? I mean, blessed be the guy who gave all this to you. Ruth answers her and tells her where she went, how she got all of this grain, and she mentions that it's Boaz. And at the mention of Boaz, Naomi's first response is to again say, "May he be blessed." But the point that she makes in verse 20 is a very important point. "May Boaz be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi wants Boaz to be blessed. She's very thankful. She's very grateful for the work that Boaz has done. But the praise that she truly gives is praise to the Lord. The Lord, it's the Lord whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. And this is a fantastic statement. Do we remember where we started with Naomi in chapter 1? We could just look back at verses 20 and 21 of chapter 1. She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" One chapter later, she's no longer talking about how the Lord has his hand against her or has brought calamity on her, but how great his kindness is and that he has not forsaken the living or the dead. This recognition comes as the true turning point of the book of Ruth. If you're reading this as a story, if you were reading this not as scripture to learn from, but just reading this as a story, this becomes the turning point of the story. We start to see something happening. Naomi has gone from this bitter person. That's what that name Mara means, bitterness. She has gone from this bitter person who says that the Lord has done almost unkind things to her, to now seeing this provision by the care of Boaz, that as God has used Boaz to provide for her, she recognizes that ultimately this is the kindness of God. The kindness of the Lord has not forsaken her. It's not the kindness of Boaz. She also blesses him for the work that he does, but she recognizes that this is a gift from God. So we have gone from the very beginning of this story where everything went wrong and Naomi was miserable, to now, through the work of Boaz and Ruth, we see this declaration from Naomi. When Naomi hears of what is going on, she comes to this seemingly very sudden recognition. One of the commentaries I read this week said it this way, and I thought this was wonderful. When Naomi learns that Ruth has met up with Boaz, the sun rises again in her life. Have you ever felt that way? Like you're just so depressed, you're so down, you're so sad that everything is dark. And then whether it's through another individual or the Lord or circumstances in life, you start to come out of that and you feel new. You feel like the sun has risen again. And it doesn't really matter what's going on outside. It has more to do with how you feel. Although we do feel that way sometimes in real life as well with the clouds and things. If it rains for a week straight and then the next day is sunny, you kind of go, what is this? It's totally different. That's where Naomi is. The sun has risen again in her life. The Lord's kindness has not forsaken her. Even through all the hardships, even through all the trials, through all the misery that she has gone through, the Lord's kindness has not forsaken her. This is very reminiscent of something that is said in Genesis chapter 24. In Genesis 24, verse 27, this is Abraham. This is the story of Abraham. And this is what is said. Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master. This idea that the Lord's steadfast love and faithfulness has not forsaken his people, whether they be living or dead. It's a theme of the entire Bible. This word, I don't do this all the time, but every now and then, it's something we need to hear. This word in Hebrew that's used here is the word chesed. And why do I bring that up? Because it's one of the most important words in the entire Bible. It is a word that is used so many times. I couldn't even count the number of times it was used in the Old Testament. But this is what it is often used of. This is how it is often translated. It is translated as faithfulness, steadfast love, kindness, or loving kindness. And this idea that God is always faithful to keep his steadfast love, that it never goes away, is one of the main themes of the whole Bible. And so we see all different uses of it. We saw it earlier in our scripture reading in Psalm 136. In Psalm 136, there are 25 verses, and 25 times the word hesed is used. The steadfast love of the Lord endures forever. We see it in plenty of other places, like Psalm 69. It's used a lot in the Psalms. In Psalm 69, which is a psalm that Jesus himself quotes from the cross, we see this in verse 13. But as for me, my prayer is to you, O Lord, at an acceptable time, O God, in the abundance of your steadfast love, answer me in your saving faithfulness. That we can cry out to God, save me because of your steadfast love and faithfulness. It's also used in the book of Lamentations. In Lamentations chapter 3, verse 22, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. That is what Naomi cries out. His hesed, his steadfast love, his loving kindness, his great faithfulness has not forsaken the living and the dead. How is this seen in Naomi's life? She makes this great declaration, but how can she say that? Is it just because her daughter-in-law came home with dinner? It's more than that. It's more than that. She sees so many of the ways that the Lord is being faithful to her, showing her kindness, showing her his steadfast love. He provides not just food for the day, but plenty of food. He has provided safety. She mentions this. You can go to this field and you can glean there. You can get the food that we need in Boaz's field without any fear of anybody doing anything wrong to you. What a blessing that is. He has provided a redeemer for them. Naomi says the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. I mentioned this last week. This idea of a redeemer, a kinsman or family redeemer, is a close relative who could marry the widow of someone who didn't have children, and when they have children, that family name would continue. And so, in that way, that family is redeemed, is continued. Boaz is a redeemer for them. He also redeems their sorrow. God has redeemed Naomi and Ruth's sorrow. He has turned their sorrow into rejoicing at the food, at the safety, at the hope of a future. And speaking of that future, there is a clear indication here from Naomi that she says it's possible that Boaz could marry Ruth. But also the length of time that they stay there. Verse 23 says that she stayed until the end of the barley and the wheat harvests. It's not just one day of food that is provided for, but it is months of dependable harvest and food that has been provided. And she stays not just for the one harvest, but for the wheat harvest as well. And so there's months of care. So Naomi sees what has happened, and she understands there is something deeper, something more meaningful going on than just dinner that night. But food and safety and a redeemer and a redemption of their sorrow and a future. As we said earlier, the sun has risen again in her life, and she has hope. I want to close this morning just by looking at a couple of points of application. We've talked a lot here about what is happening and what is going on, but why is this so important? Why does this matter or make a difference? Well, the answer is because we are cared for by the same faithful God who we see in this paragraph. We are cared for. God's steadfast love is just as real for us today as it was for Ruth and Naomi in their day. God's love is for us. His care, His unending love and faithfulness. And so these verses that we read, the other verses I read about God's love, they are applied to us as well. God's mercies are new for us. God's faithfulness is there for us to rely on. God's care and provision is for us as His children because this is the same God. And so the same steadfast love and faithfulness is available for us to go to when we are hurting, to rely on, to call out for, to trust in. God is there for us. Secondly, God still works to draw people to redemption. Think about Naomi. Think about what God has done in her life, taking her from someone who was doing what was right in her own eyes through a life of bitterness and is now drawing her back to the point where she sees that the Lord has not forsaken her, that His steadfast love and kindness is still there for her. God is working to draw her back, and He still works to draw people to redemption today. It doesn't matter what has gone on in their lives, in your life. It doesn't matter what you have done or failed to do. It doesn't matter how you have felt in the past. God can and does still draw people back to Himself. It may take time. It may take years. It may take so long that we never even live to see it, but God is still working to draw people to Himself. Another point of application that maybe is helpful for us is that God still uses His people to provide and care and lead others to Him. Like Boaz was raised and grew in his faith and then acted on his faith to provide for Ruth, God still uses people today. He uses us. He uses us as we live out our faith to bring blessings to other people. I don't think that's the main point of what's going on here, but I think it is certainly an application that we should be aware of. If Boaz had rejected the Lord and turned away from the Lord and not followed the Lord's leading, then we don't have this story of provision for Ruth. God is the one who's doing the work. It's God's kindness that is most seen and most glorified, but Boaz is living out his faith, and God is using Boaz's life